I'll take just a couple of statements about the possible conflict story. I think one, so you have to start with the idea that why might you have such a payment at all? Because you can think of contentiousness in the other direction, which is if the person upstream is dumping stuff in the water and it's their cultural habit or whatever, and people downstream, or they increase that, people downstream can't drink the water they used to drink or something, people downstream might think that they're being impinged upon. So in some ways, and if you go look at the original Coase theorem discussions, the whole point of that article is to say that the spillover can be thought of in either direction. And that doesn't mean one is right or wrong. They're probably both right. And the question is, how do you resolve it, both in terms of processes, but also maybe for the maximum benefit, but of course that requires a lot of discussion. So I think maybe a nice example at the macro level, since I was kind of macro and other people were working a little more micro in my conversation, is to think of the case of Brazil, where for a long time, Brazil didn't want you to measure the deforestation rate, right? And there was huge battles about what it was and releasing the data. And they certainly didn't want to hear about other people telling them what they should do in their forested areas. The U.S. had the, the Homestead Act to get out there and clear stuff and you can have the property. So why can't we do that? And sovereignty came up a lot, right? The word sovereignty. And that's sort of when people start saying sovereignty, that indicates some sensitivity usually. But it changes over time. I think as a slow process moves along, it becomes more clear that payments could flow, that they could be under rule of law, they could be perhaps going through a government actor, et cetera. At this meeting I was at the other day, the guy who was under Marina Silva, the environment minister, expressed shock at the rapidity in the switch within Brazil into considering the upside, which is, yeah, it's your right. And we're not telling you what to do because we can't. But you can have money if you do it. So for instance, if you run a road here or run a road there or put a park here or put a park there, it's kind of up to you. But this one would do less to the forest and we'd pay you. And that does, of course, bring up a trade-off of many values. But it is in the context of an offer. And when you get enough trust to have the discussion, a lot of things get traded off that before were untouchable. Now that said, in that same meeting, very interesting questions about, for instance, if it's true, this is what I was told, that in the extractive reserves that are not indigenous in the Amazon, you're spending $50 or whatever a hectare to maintain. And in the indigenous, you're spending $2. So you have very tricky questions. You say, look, it's obvious, indigenous is great, it's a real value. You turn that around and you say, you know what, someone will never pay the indigenous folks because by paying them nothing, they save it anyway. So they're in the baseline, so you don't pay them. So these many issues of who controls the land, what would they do otherwise, how do you design it, and how do you create a network where people who have no idea what you mean by carbon emissions to the atmosphere at least recognize that the trade-off being offered is do this in your land and you get money. And not a lot of other things that they could think. Involves a hell of a lot of communication down to the level, so at least the offer is understood as it was offered. So I think there are a lot of things to do, but offers are different from mandates. When communicated, they're still offers, but there's a lot of work to get to the issues that you're talking about. That's what I can think of.
I suggest one way to promote spending money on environmentally desirable ways is to provide economic motivation. That is, make the alternatives more expensive. As a successful illustration of this, at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, we had a student traffic problem. And the way this was faced was to increase the cost of parking cars on campus and use the profit for this to finance a very good free bus system. It's reduced student traffic and also provided jobs for students to drive the buses. So perhaps looking at this at in the larger public sphere, what we ought to do is to make the operation of individual cars more expensive for the user, but use the money to improve public transportation.
I agree.
That's exactly what Lindsey does every day of her life. Thank you all. Thank you for a great panel, for your great presentations.